Welcome to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast, addressing all aspects of the digital enterprise, inspiring connection without boundaries and creation without limits. Thank you for tuning in. Here are your hosts, Thom Singer and Craig Brown.
Well, hello. You have found your way to another episode of the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in every single week. Or if this is your first time listening to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast, thank you for being here, and I hope you will come back every week. We designed this show to be a resource for those who work in and around PLM. The Digital Enterprise Society, it is a forum for the exchange of ideas surrounding the tools, processes, and practices used across the product lifecycle. To learn more, be sure to visit digitalenterprisesociety.org. My name is Thom Singer, and I have the honor to co-host this show for, it's almost been 2 years. And my co-host, Craig Brown, he is an industry veteran and former PLM leader at General Motors. But today, you just have me. Heck, there's not even a guest, because today I want to talk to you about the importance of networking and why, in the midst of this global pandemic and social distancing and working from home and having your team dispersed, why networking and human connection really matters more than ever. But before we get started, I want to tell you about something that's really special. The Digital Enterprise Society has partnered with the Agile Strategy Lab to bring you this customized 7-week online course, Agile Leadership for Digital Transformation. This course will give you the tools you need to help your team and the whole organization thrive. Now is the time to invest in yourself. Understand and implement the skills of agile leadership to meet the challenges of the digital transformation. So remember, space is limited, so you want to register today at digitalenterprisesociety.org. So every single week on this podcast, we try to bring you interesting ideas and thoughts, usually through interviews, but to help all of the listeners enhance and grow their careers. And today, I wanted to take a little time to talk to you about what is not always everybody's favorite subject, and that is networking. Sometimes people who are sort of more on that left brain side, they work around technology, maybe they self-identify as an introvert, when they hear the word networking, they cringe. They think, oh my God, do I have to? However, you've got to remember that all opportunities in life, no matter what they are, in your personal life, your professional life, all opportunities come from people. Therefore, if you want to excel and grow in your career, the people you encounter and the people who you build long-term and mutually beneficial relationships with, those people are going to matter so much. And sometimes you don't see the payoff for a long, long time. It is a long-term play to build relationships that will lead to that mutually beneficial relationship where both of you succeed more because of the relationships than you would without it. But you can't wave a magic wand and suddenly be friends with everybody who you've ever encountered in the business world. And for the last 10 months, it's been even harder because the global pandemic and the quarantine has really caused people to have to pull back. So many people found their only real social outlet, or one of their only social outlets, was going to work every day. Now, that didn't mean that everyone at work was your best friend, but a lot of the conversations that people had really took place sort of around that idea of the water cooler. And today I want to talk about what has changed and what has remained the same over the last 10 months and why it's so important that you're having conversations with people who work in and around this world of PLM, because you don't know when you're going to need a new job, and you certainly don't know when the next opportunity is going to just drop into your lap. But if you're not connected with people, none of that can happen. So you've got to have conversations. You've got to be talking to people. Now, this is kind of weird in the day where you're sitting at home and, does a text count? So I want to talk about this. So I want to focus in first on this idea of conversations, because human relationships, connections, friendships, bonds are built through shared experiences. And here's the thing. One of the ways we share experiences is having conversations. But when I work with teams and individuals, one of the things I always tell them, and I try to remind them all the time, is that don't overthink this. Sometimes people get so nervous before they go to a networking event, or they log on to some sort of a virtual networking event, or they have to jump on the phone with their boss or someone else that they work with, and they're worried about, what am I going to say? How is the conversation going to go? So here's the thing I want you to remember. Conversations, real human-to-human engagement. Conversations don't have scripts, which means you can't script out everything that you plan to say in every conversation that you're going to have with anyone who you could encounter. And for some people, that's scary because they're afraid, what if the conversation doesn't go well? But here's my thought. Conversations, they can free flow, and you just have to get confident with it. And like any skill, you can work this out. You work it out by doing it. The more you converse with people, the more you pay attention to the little nuances of how conversations go when you do have these conversations, the better you're going to get at it. So, what I'm talking about is really just thinking through this whole idea of how do I have a better conversation with people? So I'm going to give you a couple of tips. I'm kind of free-flowing this conversation, but this whole topic really excites me. And I hope that most of you, are still listening now that we're a few minutes into this conversation. Because if you want conversations in your professional life and your personal life to go better, to move smoother, I'm going to give you, I think I'll come up with about 6 ideas. And if you grasp hold of those ideas, you're going to be able to say, it's a lot easier to converse than I thought it was. So number 1, be curious about the people who you're talking to. It doesn't matter if it's a coworker, your boss, a vendor, a customer. Be curious about who they are and what brought them to this stage of their career. Therefore, ask questions of them about what was their path that got them there. The more curious you are about them as a person and them in the role that they play in their professional life, the more they're actually going to like you. They've actually done surveys, and they say that when you've probably seen things like this on like reality TV. They send people out on a date and they record everything. You know what I'm talking about. They put a camera in the flowers, they float a microphone in the beer glass, and they record everything. And then afterwards, they take them separately and say, hey, what did you think? The person who talked the most usually says, wow, I really like him. I hope we get married and have 5 kids. The person who talks the least sometimes says, yeah, they were fine. I wasn't that interested. Well, in the same conversation, how can you have that disparity? Well, the person who talks the most generally seems to like the other person a lot. So the more curious you are about the person you're talking to, the more you can ask questions, the better off you're going to be in that likability factor. So you want to get people talking about who they are, what they do, what they're bringing to the project. And then within this same tip of curiosity, you want to make sure you listen. So often in business, when people are having a conversation, what happens is one person is talking, and instead of really listening and being curious about what they're saying, the other person is thinking, how do I respond? When you're curious, you don't need to always have a response. You don't need to always show that you're their equal or better than them. Sometimes you can just be curious and listen and nod. So my first tip is embrace that curiosity. The second tip is look for things that you have in common with people. This is one of the things when I teach people how to network and I talk about using LinkedIn. Before you ever have a first conversation with someone in business, you should check out their LinkedIn profile. And the reason you do this is you want to look for something you have in common. Did you both go to the University of Michigan? Did you both go to Dartmouth? Did you both go to Carnegie Mellon? Maybe you both went to San Diego State University. Doesn't matter where you went to school. If you have the same alma mater, suddenly you have something in common, even if you were there 30 years apart. Also, did you used to work for the same companies? I know that a lot of people who work in PLM have moved around between a lot of similar companies. And even if you weren't at the same place at the same time, you might have known some of the same people. You might have reported to the same supervisor. You might have worked on the same projects. So when you can find things that you have in common, that helps make the conversation go better. So every time you have a first meeting with somebody, make sure you invest a little bit of time up front to be able to, look for those things in common. And the best way to do that is to go to LinkedIn. Now, when you go to LinkedIn, look at a couple of places. Number 1, where did they go to school? What's their education? Even if you both majored in computer science, that's a place to start. The second thing is where have they worked in the past? Then also, what groups do they belong to? Not everybody, but a lot of people on LinkedIn will click on groups that they have an interest in. So maybe it's a charity group, maybe it's an alumni group, maybe it's something of interest in politics. But just look for things that people follow when it comes to groups, because maybe you share a super similar passion. And then the final thing is take a look at what friends you have in common. LinkedIn will often show you that you have 16 friends in common, or 6 friends in common, or 600 friends in common. Take a look at that list and see what those similarities are. Then when you get into that initial conversation, it's okay to tell that person, hey, before this call, I looked you up on LinkedIn and I see that we both know Mary Smith. How do you know Mary? Now, they may not really know her very well because some people link on LinkedIn to everyone who breathes air. That's not what I recommend. I think you should have some sort of a connection or at least a reason to be having that link to somebody on LinkedIn. So if you click on somebody that I know, the odds are I've probably met them and had a conversation of some value before I accept a LinkedIn request. But that's not true of everybody. So they may answer, oh, we're connected on LinkedIn. Maybe I met her at a conference. I don't know who she is. Or they're going to come back and say, oh my gosh, that's my sister-in-law. How do you know her? Well, that was my college roommate. Oh my gosh, small world. Guess what? That unscripted conversation just got really interesting when you find something that you have in common with people. The third tip I have for you is be intentional when you go into conversations. So if you're going into a meeting with your team, or you're having a networking coffee with somebody, or maybe you've set up a one-on-one Zoom call, or for whatever reason that you're going to be talking to people, know what your purpose is for being there. Have an intention. And sometimes in conversations, the intention is just to get to know somebody. And if that's your intention, you'll go back to that first tip of, being curious and look, and the second tip of finding things in common, if you know what your intention is. So many times people end up in conversations and they don't really know why they're there. They've never really thought it out. And this is even true when people go on job interviews. They accept the job interview and they're having the conversation, but they don't really know what their intention is. They haven't really thought through, do I even want this job? Why am I interviewing with this person? So make sure that you've put a lot of intention into why you're having that conversation. Now, another way to make your conversations more engaging is have a story to tell. Now, again, I don't think this should be scripted, and the story you're going to tell is not going to be the same every single time that you sit down and talk to people. Think about this. Have you ever been to a cocktail party and someone's there and that person tells the same story to everybody they meet, and now you've heard the story a million times? That's not necessarily a person who you find interesting. But have you also been to some sort of a social gathering and there's someone you've met 3 or 4 times, and every time that you're either in a conversation with them or you overhear them talking to somebody else, they always have something interesting to say. It's not braggadocious. It's not name dropping. It's just fascinating. People often say, wow, that person has more experiences than I do. No, that person has just paid attention to what is an interesting story. So take a look at your own career and your own life. What are some of the interesting, fun, unique things that you've done? Just be aware of them. Don't force them into a conversation. But if somebody comes up and starts talking about something and you have something interesting that you can share, then you have an interesting story to share. That's fascinating. So I recently was on a call and it was a Zoom networking event. And I don't know, I think there were about 20 people on the call. And somebody made a joke about in their whole world, they've never met anybody who was on a reality TV show or a television game show. And they were making a joke that, are these people real or are they all actors? I'm 50 years old and I've never once met someone who's been on a TV show, like a reality show or a game show. And I raised my hand and made a little laugh and they called on me. Well, here's the interesting thing. I've been on 2 television game shows. Now, both of them were in the 70s and the 80s. Once I was 6 years old and once I was 21 years old. So this is trust me, I'm much older than that. That was a long time ago. However, I was on a show called Truth or Consequences with Bob Barker. Now, most of you are far too young to remember that show, but back in the 1970s, it was a primetime television show and it was super popular. In the 80s, I was on a morning game show on CBS called The $25,000 Pyramid, hosted by Dick Clark. Now, if people are of the right age, that becomes an interesting story. It's a true story, and people always want to know, how did you get on that? So it's something I can say. Now, I'm not going to work that in to every single conversation, but because somebody made a joke about never having met anybody on a game show, I suddenly had something interesting to say. So have a little file in your head of the things you've accomplished, the people you've met, the things you've done, and if it's relevant, be able to raise your hand and step up and tell your stories, because the human brain is wired for stories. People learn not from data and spreadsheets. In fact, if you go back thousands of years, Humans did not sit around in their communities around that campfire, and the elders of the tribe did not teach people by handing out a pie chart and an Excel spreadsheet. They taught people by telling stories. And they have proven that when you can attach a story to some data, people are more likely to remember the data, and they're more likely to remember the person who brought that to them. So that's my fourth tip is be able to tell stories when it's appropriate. My fifth tip is don't prejudge people. So often we go into conversations and we decide, that person doesn't bring anything to this situation, or, oh my gosh, that's the boss's boss. They're probably a jerk. We don't know that. Don't prejudge people. Don't judge people based on how they look. Don't judge people based on their education or their job title. Give everybody the chance. And by not prejudging and turning on that first tip of curiosity, sometimes you can open the floodgates where you just have that unscripted, really interesting conversation, and that person has stories to tell, and you have stories to tell. And it really gets interesting. So that's the fifth tip. You probably want the sixth one, since I said I would give you 6 tips on how to have better conversations. So the sixth one that I'll give you is to have fun. Now, I don't mean to be giggly if you're at work having a thing with your boss, but anytime you interact with other people, realize that it is a chance to learn. It is a chance to connect. It is a chance for opportunity to come. So enjoy it. Even if you're dealing with something that might be a little more serious, it still can be fun to have the people together. It still can be something that you realize that you're going to learn from that. So if you're a little bit trepidatious, if you're a little bit scared of conversations, this is a learned skill. The more you do it, the more it's going to become second nature. And the more you become comfortable going into conversations, the more you're going to have that ability. You're going to have that ability to be able to connect with people. So that's my 6 tips on how to have better conversations that are unscripted and that are just part of this human experience that we're all in. So I want you to think for a minute. When I talk about the importance of conversations when it comes to connecting with people, think about the best conversations you've ever had in your life. Now, for each of us, this is going to be very different, but I want you to think about the best chats that you've ever had. Maybe this was in high school or college or some other time where you and a friend stayed up all night and you just laughed and you giggled and you shared and you did that. You weren't scripted. Think about the team meetings that you've been in within your company where maybe they order pizza in and everybody shuts off their phones and there's a whiteboard and all of a sudden everybody is totally engaged and things really start to click and it's just that mind meld of people. That's awesome when that happens at work. And then also think about when you've been at a networking function, whether it's online or back when we could do these things face to face, and you're standing around, maybe you're a little, more introverted, and you just start to have a conversation with that one person. And all of a sudden, everything in that conversation starts to come together. You used to work at the same place. You knew some of the same people. That conversation starts to build. And at the end of the night, you're like, wow, I am so glad I met that person. All of those scenarios, whatever you thought of, they were all unscripted. They were all just people allowing themselves to connect on that soul level. And that's why I think networking doesn't have to be hard. When you go into this idea of how do I connect with people, it doesn't have to be difficult, and you don't really have anything that you have to prove. Now, for the last 10 months or so, we have been in this global pandemic, and the normal ways that people network and connect with other people in many ways have been pulled back. Now, what I have found from working with a whole bunch of companies, talking to a lot of people, is some individuals and some organizations have done a great job of keeping people connected. Some have done a really horrible job, and the culture of their organization is really suffering. And most of us fall somewhere in the middle where it's certainly been difficult and we certainly feel isolated. But the truth is that most people fall into that second or third category. It's either fine or a little less than fine, or they're really struggling to get that human connection. So if you want to find ways to be able to network while this pandemic goes on, and this social distancing could go on for another 4, 6, 12 months, God forbid, maybe longer, you have to take ownership of really finding ways that you want to connect. You have to take the ownership that you're going to be the one who puts human connection as a priority. So here's a couple of tips for you as you look at how do I network during a pandemic? Well, number one, live events aren't happening, at least for the time being. Maybe soon after we get enough shots in arms, we're going to be able to have some hybrid events. But for the time being, Most industry networking events are taking place via the computer. So it's all online. So my first step is attend things. You can find things through the Digital Enterprise Society and other organizations where people are getting together. They're having, some sort of a seminar, and then there's networking following it. Find out, ask around, ask people in your industry, ask people in your company, ask people at former companies who are part of your network. Ask them, how can I get involved with some online networking events? And then make sure you show up. Now, many of these then send people to breakout rooms. They'll have a big group of like 100 people who listen to a presentation, and then they break people up into groups of 3, 4, 5. If it's more than 5, it gets a little difficult, but they break people up into the networking groups. Make sure that you stay for that. Yesterday, before I recorded this, I attended a corporate event, and they had 250 people at the event for an hour listening to the presentation, but only 60 stayed for the networking. Now, that's great that people have time, they're busy, they have things going on. But those 60, I don't know how many of them made a connection with somebody who was awesome, but I bet you some of them did, because being able to stay and have a conversation and say, what did you think about that is a great thing. So number one, find ways to attend things in this online world. Number two, reach out to the contacts you already have. Think about this for a minute. If I asked you to make a list of the 20 people in business who you think would be the best people for you to keep in touch with, whether it's inside your company, outside your company, people you used to work with, former vendors, former customers, if you made a list of 20 key people where you're like, yep, I should be networking with these people, how many of them have you talked to, and I mean actually talked to, since last March? Most people I talk to shake their head and say not very many of them. So again, you have to take the ownership. Make the list of the people in your list of contacts who you really think you should be socially tightening with while we're doing this socially distancing. And by socially tightening, it's how do you bring those people closer while physically we have to be apart? So reach out to them. And if you live in a city with a warm climate where outdoor coffee or a glass of wine or lunch is possible, and if you're comfortable with it, maybe you could meet somebody face to face. But for most of us, it's the winter, and our states have laws where everything is closed. So our option is, how do we get a hold of them, either through a video meeting, through something like Zoom, or a telephone call? And all you have to do is email or text them and say, I haven't talked to you for a while. I would love the chance just to catch up. Do you have some time for maybe like a 20-minute phone call or Zoom call where, we could get together? In many cases, people will say yes. And then you just have to schedule that call. So that's really important. Another option is, if you're not finding really great events where you can get together and network with people in your industry, take it upon yourself to look at that list of contacts that you have and put together something on your own. Why don't you say, hey, Friday at 4 o'clock Central Time, I'm going to open up my Zoom room and I'm going to invite, about 10 people to come, bring your beverage of choice and let's just talk about what's going on in the world amongst the type of work that you do, and get some key people who have similar type jobs. Maybe they don't even know each other. What I'm saying for this third tip is be the person who organizes those get-togethers. And maybe they're on a serious topic. Heck, maybe they're fun. One company that I know did a team meeting for everyone on their team because they're dispersed, and it was wear a funny hat. And everybody got on Zoom and everybody had on funny hats, and they just had conversation. But the fact is that they made it fun because of the funny hat rule. And people who showed up who didn't have funny hats, they made them go get something to put on their head, even if it was a napkin. So they just made it a fun experience. Is it as great as having the world be open where you can go and network and be at live events? No, but make the best of it. And if you're not finding the type of gatherings that you want, go and plan your own. Think about this for a minute. Sometimes people go, oh, that would be weird if I planned a Zoom meeting for 10 people. And I'm like, make a list of those 10 people you'd like to see there. What if one of them invited you? Would that be weird? And usually people are like, no, if they invited me, I'd totally go. It would be cool. Guess what? They're going to think the same thing. So if you're not finding places to connect with key people in your network, create the safe space for people to come together and talk. And then my final tip, sort of in this way of how do you network during a pandemic? My final tip is keep scheduling those one-on-one appointments with the people you work closely with. Now, the example I'm going to use is inside a company, but you can do it with customers just as well. And that is make them happen regularly. So one company I know, they have about 50 people, and every week they have a computer-generated list that pairs up 2 people together. and those people are required to set up a 15-minute call together. Now, here's what's interesting. It could be the receptionist and the CEO. It's not planned. It's totally random, and it changes every single week. But what it's doing is it's keeping the culture of their company alive. Plus, their company has grown by like 15 people since the pandemic started. So, 1/4 of those people who are on the call don't know anybody. So every week they get to meet someone new inside the company because they're not meeting physically in the same place. So find ways to keep groups together, but also push people into one-on-one conversations. So those are my tips for just some ways that you can network during this pandemic. Let's face it, as I started this call, I said that all opportunities in life come from people. If you're feeling distanced because of the situation that we're in, it might make your career stall because those opportunities are going to go to people who are top of mind. So networking is not a bad word. We can call it human connection. We can call it keeping in touch. We can call it whatever you want. But the whole idea of it is that if we can have unscripted conversations that bring us closer together with other people who work in and around the same industry that we have, our careers, and I argue our personal lives, are going to get better. So I hope for some of you, this was a message that resonates. If anybody says, okay, Thom, you've challenged me, but I'm not so sure, I have some further questions, I will open it up to anybody in the Digital Enterprise Society. You can email me at Thom, Thom, at thomsinger.com, and I will answer any questions you have. Just make the subject line, because I get so much spam, right? I get so much spam. We're in a world where everybody is broadcast. I tell people more personal, less broadcast. But the way to make me know this is a personal email is put something in the subject line that says, was listening to the DES podcast, or something where I'm going to be like, oh, that's a personal email about the networking that I talked about on this episode. So go ahead and reach out to me and tell me your situation, and I will gladly share with you any thoughts, ideas, tips that come to my mind. So I hope that you'll tune in next week. Craig will be back with me. We're going to have some fascinating interviews coming up very, very soon. So I want you to join us every single week right here on the Digital Enterprise Society podcast for more thoughts, ideas, and information in and around a career in product lifecycle management. The Digital Enterprise Society, it is the place for the exchange of ideas around digital manufacturing tools. Go check us out right now at digitalenterprisesociety.org.
You've been listening to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. Learn more about what you've heard here today at digitalenterprisesociety.org. Join us again next week for more connection without boundaries and creation without limits.